believe in the power of community, the power of strategic partnerships, sharing best practices, and actually utilizing the network to its fullest capability. And when it comes to those four things, the four of these faces on the screen, we are actually walking the talk. We're doing what we preach. And this webinar is part of a series that our four Nordic AmChams are cooperating on. And many of you may not know that we touch base on a monthly basis. And actually during the height of the virus this spring, I was speaking with these gentlemen and members of their team and Jason in Norway on almost a weekly basis. And all of these conversations are about how we can better serve you and make sure that our members at our respective AmChams, all of whom operate independently, can take advantage of this Nordic network. So with that, a warm hello to those of you I haven't met. A warm welcome to our members and our stakeholders. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd like to pass the floor to my Nordic colleagues. Gentlemen, Tyler, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Alexandra. All right, my name is Tyler Barrett. I'm the member and communications consultant here at AmCham Norway. I'm filling in for our managing director, Jason Turflinger. Today, I would like to welcome all of the AmCham Norway members and partners who are with us today, and also all of the member representatives and partners from across the Nordics. You know, when I phone home to my parents in the US and other friends there, it's really exciting to talk about how engaged people are with American politics here in Scandinavia in our neck of the woods. So I'm really looking forward to what Brad has to say today. So I'll pass the torch on to Peter, but thank you.
Thank you, Tyler, and I want to thank Alexandra and her team for putting this together and for the great intro. I think that our Nordic cooperation means a lot to me personally and to our team, and I know to our members as well, because of these opportunities and also because of the best practices we can share. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank Brad in advance for taking his time to share his insights into the U.S. electorate and what is, I think, widely held belief to be the most important U.S. Election, at least in modern times. So thank you, Brad. And I want to also welcome all of AmCham Sweden's members and partners who are on the call today. And with that, I'll turn things over to my friend Steve.
Hey, thanks, Peter. And thank you, Alexandra, for organizing this. And thanks to your team. Great to be part of this Nordic initiative. This is the second in line of many that we're going to be doing, particularly around the U.S. Elections coming up. So great opportunity to engage across the Nordics. So also a warm welcome to all the AmCham Denmark members joining us today. Great to have you with us, and we look forward to a fantastic session with the Pew Research Center. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to intro our speaker now. So I'm going to ask everyone, including my colleagues, please turn off your video and mute your microphones, and we will get started. So with less than 100 days to go, as I said, until the US presidential elections, the country is struggling with a pandemic, a reeling economy, and a divided electorate. And we are proud to host our speaker today to take a look at that from Pew Research Center, who will offer a deeper understanding of the American electorate and some of the key issues at play. Now, Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan fact tank that informs the public about the issues, attitudes, and trends shaping the world. They conduct public opinion polling, demographic research, content analysis, and other data-driven social science research. And on our annual trips to DC, we have always made a point, the Nordic AmChams have always made a point to touch base with the Pew Research Center. So we appreciate your information and your ongoing cooperation. Now, our speaker today is Brad Jones, a research associate at Pew Research Center, where he primarily works on US public opinion about politics. And he's involved actually in all the stages of the research process at the center. He has a doctorate in political science from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and he regularly presents to outside audiences, and today he is here to present to ours. So a warm welcome to Brad. And before I hand the floor over, I just want to say that while Brad is speaking, if questions come to you, please feel free to pop them in our meeting chat. I will be moderating that meeting chat. And Brad and I have agreed that if a question comes up that's extremely timely, I will pose it to him while he's speaking. But otherwise, once he's done, there will be plenty of time for Q&A, and we will get to that then. So thank you very much. And Brad, a warm welcome to you. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. I'm excited to be with you all virtually. And here's to hoping that we can have you in our offices in the not too far distant future. Let me see if I can bring up the slides here. All right, are you seeing these?
Yes, we're seeing those. And if someone has if everyone can check that their microphones are muted, please, that would be great. Thank you. All right, we can see that perfectly.
Great. All right. Well, no, I'm not being able to see it. All right, hit a little snag here on the, here we go. Okay, so I wanted to start the presentation today by talking briefly about some long-running trends in American politics, just to set the stage a little bit for an audience that might not be as intimately familiar with all the ins and outs of American politics. So what I've got up on the slide here is a chart showing the changing demographics of the US electorate over the last 25 years. This comes from our telephone data. We've conducted telephone surveys for many, many years, and in the last few years, we've moved on to the web for our data collection. But what this data shows is the changing racial and educational makeup of the United States. And so in many ways, the present moment is extraordinary. We have a pandemic. The president was impeached just not too long ago, and we have so many things that seem unprecedented. But another way to look at trends in American politics is as continuations of these long-running trends. So we can see on the left side part of this plot the share of the electorate and of each party who are non-white. So over the past 25 years, the country has diversified, and the share of the white population has shrunk relative to the share of the non-white population. That's especially true in the Democratic Party and for those who lean towards the Democratic Party. So in 1994, 23% of Democrats were non-white. In 2019, that share had grown to 40%. The Republican Party has also become somewhat more diverse, although they have been consistently less diverse than the Democratic Party. In 1994, 6% of Republicans were non-white. And today that number is closer to 17%. When we look at the white population in these second two panels, one of the important trends there is in education. So college-educated whites have been trending towards the Democratic Party over the last 25 years. In 1994, as a share of the whole party, they made up only 18%. That has grown to 10 percentage points to 28% today. Whereas it's been relatively static for Republicans. We see a much bigger trend in this final panel when we look at the share of the electorate who are non-college whites. And so this group gets a lot of attention in recent years. It's been shrinking as a share of the electorate overall. And that's especially true in the Democratic Party. So among Republicans in 1994, 68% of Republicans were non-college educated whites. That has shrunk somewhat to 57% today, but if you look at the trend among Democrats, it's really pretty striking that in 1994, 57% of Democrats were non-college whites. Today, that number is only 30%. Another important trend in American politics and politics around the world, actually, is the gap between men and women. So we can see in this chart that women are consistently more likely to identify with the Democratic Party or lean towards the Democratic Party than are men. In recent years, that gap has widened to as big as we've ever seen it in our data. And that's especially true, again, when we look by education among college-educated women. So 65% of college-educated women today identify or lean towards the Democratic Party, whereas only 48% of college-educated men do so. The gender gap is present among non-college graduates, but it is somewhat smaller than where we see it among college-educated men and women. All right, the other important trend in American politics is the rise of the importance of partisanship. This is one of the most remarkable things that I think we've published in my time since I've been at the Pew Research Center. So I'm going to pause here a little bit and walk you through this. So over the past 25 years, we have been asking periodically a set of 10 political values that run the gamut between the government's role in the economy to environmental issues, to attitudes about traditional morality and foreign policy. It really covers the breadth of political discussion in the United States. When we look across these 10 items, so what we're showing on the chart here is the average gap among different demographic groups. So in this darker line at the top, we have the average gap between whites and blacks in the United States across these 10 political values. So you can see in general, whites are more likely to take the conservative position on these issues. In 1994, when we average across these 10 different items, on average, whites are 14 percentage points more likely to take the conservative position across those issues. That's remained relatively stable over the last 25 years. It shrunk a little bit in 2019 to 10 points. We can also look at the difference between men and women. As I showed you in that previous plot, women are more likely to identify with the Democratic Party. They're also more likely to take the left position on these values. And so you can see that gap is relatively unchanged over the past 10 years, or 25 years. When we look by religious attendance or education or age, we see a very similar pattern. Important divides in American politics, but relatively stable over the past quarter century. What is not the same is the role of partisanship. So when we look at the difference between Republicans and Democrats, in 1994, the gap was pretty similar to what we see between whites and blacks. However, that gap has increased steadily over the past 25 years and is now at the widest point that we've ever seen it in the public. So what we have really seen is the Democratic Party becoming the party of the left and the Republican Party becoming the party of the right, where those ideological divides weren't always present in the past. And like I say, this is, I think, one of the key things to understand about US politics. All right, so getting into some of our more contemporary data, talking about the election and, of course, the pandemic. So Americans are dissatisfied. We have seen the largest gap that we've ever seen in our data in terms of the share who say they're satisfied or dissatisfied with the way that things are going in the country. We also see overwhelming majorities say that they feel angry or fearful about the way things are going in the country today. And all of this in an election year. So as was mentioned in the introduction, this is the American public certainly sees this as one of the most important presidential elections in the last 20 years. When we have asked this question, going back to 2000, the election between Bush and Gore, we saw that the public was about evenly divided between the share who said that it really mattered who won the election and the share who thought that things would basically be the same regardless of who was elected. That is certainly was not the case in 2016 when that gap widened to as large as we'd ever seen it, and now it's even wider, with 83% of the public saying that it really matters who wins the election in November.
Sorry, I'm going to interject. Can I ask, with that previous slide, is there a split there between Republicans and Democrats? Does this data lean towards Democrats really feel that it matters, Republicans, or is this just split halfway in the
it really is on both sides, and this next chart sort of demonstrates that in a way that it maybe wasn't to such a great degree even last year. So during the same period, we've asked this question about whether voters feel that neither Republican candidate or Democratic candidate would make a good president, or whether either one would make a good president. And we see record lows saying that they agree with both of those statements. So only 8% say they agree that either Trump or Biden would make a good president, and 21% say that neither. And we can see a big part of that movement, to get to your question there, is among Republicans from 2016. So in 2016, in the sort of post-nomination period, pre-election period, the Republican Party was still fairly ambivalent about Donald Trump. 46% of Republicans in 2016 said that neither Trump nor Clinton would make a good president. That has dropped really dramatically to only 14% in 2020, and we have 22% of Democrats who say that. So, so this year we've really seen it among both Republicans and Democrats.
Thank you very much.
So to get to that, the horse race. So we, like most other polling organizations, show Biden with a pretty substantial lead over Trump overall. So most other polling organizations have something in this neighborhood, and it actually hasn't moved that much over the course of the campaign, with the gap widening and tightening somewhat. But when we follow up with our Trump supporters and our Biden supporters, and we ask them how strongly they're supporting their candidate, we see that Trump supporters are substantially more likely than Biden supporters. 66% of Trump supporters say they strongly support Trump, compared to only 46% of Biden supporters who say they strongly support their candidate. When we follow up yet again with voters and ask them if they're certain to support their candidate, or if they feel like they might change their mind at some point, we see that again the gap has basically closed. Among Biden supporters, 84% say that they're certain to support Biden. Among Trump voters, 85% say they're certain to support Biden, and the difference here comes from moderate Biden supporters being significantly more likely than moderate Trump supporters to say that they're certain that they're going to support their candidate, rather than they might change their mind. And so that's sort of where we are at the state of the race right now. One of the big wild cards in this election is turnout. It's always important for campaigns to mobilize voters. Of course, it's especially confusing this year with so much uncertainty about the pandemic. So I wanted again lay the groundwork here with some comparative data on turnout in the United States. So when we look across the OECD countries, we see the United States actually lags behind most other countries in terms of the share of the public who actually turns out and votes in a given election. This is comparing turnout in the 2016 election to comparable national elections across the OECD countries. The US comes in 26th out of the 32 countries in terms of the share of the voting age population that actually turns out to vote. One of the big reasons for that is this gap here. So the fainter yellow points on this graph show the share of registered voters who turn out to vote. So in the United States, one of the big hurdles to voting is registration. Elections are administered at the local level, at the county level, sub-state governments. And these, the onus is on the individual voter to maintain their voting registration. So when I moved from Wisconsin to Virginia 4 years ago, I had to look up the information about how to register and submit the forms and make sure that I had all of my documentation in order to vote. And even if I were to move from the apartment I'm living in now to another place down the street, I would have to be sure to update that, and I'd be ineligible to vote if I went and tried to do that without submitting the proper paperwork. In a lot of other countries, the registration is handled by the state.
Hold on a moment. This is where I
yeah.
have to interject again. Two things. One, since you mentioned how to vote abroad for the American citizens online, I just have to say, if you are not already registered to vote, just register and request your absentee ballot from fvap.gov. I will put it in the chat. It's a fairly easy process. It is different for every state. Your state is either your last address that you lived in the US, or usually the address you put down when you are, for example, doing your taxes. But if you haven't registered yet, there is still time. So I'll put that in the chat. Sorry about that, Brad. I just had to since you mentioned it.
Yeah, no, that's good. It is, anything we can do to lower those barriers to participation, I think.
And actually, since I interrupted you so abruptly, we did have a question come into the chat right around the time that you were talking about which way the polls were leaning and the support Biden had versus the support President Trump had. And that question was, last time the polls were so incredibly wrong right up to the election. Can they be better trusted now?
Sure. So we can. This is a question we regularly get, as you might expect. So polling is in a lot of flux in the United States at the moment. In our, like I alluded to before, we've transitioned most of our work onto the internet, partly because of declining response rates on the telephone. And I could spend an hour talking about methodological issues regarding polling, but I'll spare you, and we can do more of that in the Q&A if people are really interested. Actually, in 2016, the national polls were fairly accurate. So when you look at what the national polls were showing, you saw Clinton with a narrow but significant lead, and in fact, the election turned out to have Clinton win the popular vote. Where people were perhaps misled a little bit was in the prediction models that proliferate around election time. So these models try to take state level polling, which is much more difficult to do and varies in quality pretty dramatically, to try to estimate the probability that a particular candidate will win. As we saw in 2016 and in several election cycles previous, the popular vote getter is not necessarily the person who wins the election, right? So there's this complicated kind of calculus you need to do in terms of the Electoral College and where the support is located, and there's hundreds of pages of postmortem after the 2016 election about how those upper Midwest states, perhaps the polling there was missed this moment. And like I say, we can get into more of those details if people are interested. So at the Pew Research Center, we really focus, we're less interested in predicting the outcome of the election in terms of trying to determine who is going to, which states are going to go which way, and trying to read the tea leaves there. And much more interested in looking at these broader trends in opinion, the correlates of support, how these different voters are feeling about it. And this is data that I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't think it could be trusted. I'm happy to go into more detail there later, but I think the big takeaway is the national polls were accurate in 2016. The challenge comes from trying to take these opinion polls, which are snapshots at a particular time, and project that forward to an actual prediction of the outcome of the election. I'm going to carry on if that's okay.
Please go ahead.
Great. So we were talking about voter turnout and the uncertainty surrounding what's to come in the election. So one of the challenges with studying elections in the United States is that, like I said, they are administered at very local levels. So the 50 states have 50 different ways of conducting their elections, and that is in more flux this year than we have ever seen it, as the states kind of scramble to determine what is the best way to handle voting during a pandemic. One of the ways that states have tried to do this is by making voting by mail more accessible, not just to people who live overseas, like many of the people in the audience, but to people who have concerns about the coronavirus, or for whom it is just too difficult to vote on election day. And contrary to many other places around the world, election day in the United States falls during a weekday. It's not a holiday, and so people have to take off time from work or other things to try to go cast their ballots, and that can be a burden on some. So we've seen over the past 20 years a steady rise in the share of ballots that are cast by mail. In 1996, about 8% of all voters reported sending in a mail-in ballot, an absentee ballot. In 2016, that number had risen to about 21%. That's not even across the country. So there are some states that have conducted their elections entirely by mail for many years now. Washington, Oregon, the state of Utah, Hawaii is been moving in that direction, and had plans to do the 2020 election all by mail prior to the pandemic. But because of the pandemic, many states have sent either are planning on sending ballots to all registered voters in their jurisdiction, or sending applications for mail-in ballots to all voters, or just expanding the accessibility of these things. And there's a few states that haven't made those moves at all. And I'm going to show you in the next slide some variation in opinions from voters across those different kinds of states. But overall, when we ask people, people are about split. 40% say they want to vote in person on election day. There's a lot of the political scientists call it the civic religion of American politics, the rituals surrounding voting, and people like that kind of thing, to be able to go and see people in their community cast a ballot and feel like they're being part of it. You get a little sticker, and it's a whole thing. So 40% of the public says they would prefer to vote in public, vote in person. Another 40% about says they prefer to vote by mail, and then we have about 20% saying they want to go early to the polling place. We see, the demographic divides are all interesting here. In the interest of time, I want to focus on the divide by candidate support. So 60% of Trump voters told us they wanted to vote in person, versus about 17% of Trump supporters said they wanted to vote by mail. Those numbers are about flipped for Biden supporters, where 58% tell us they would like to vote by mail. 23% say they would like to vote in person. When we look at this across these different regimes that the states have in place for how the elections will be conducted, like I say, some states have been conducting their elections by mail and are just going to sort of carry on the plans they have always had. There's another set of states where all voters will be mailed a ballot, like I said, and they will have the option of sending that back in or going to vote in person. There is another set of states that allows all their voters to vote by absentee if they have concerns about coronavirus or for other reasons. And then finally, there's a set of states that only permit mail-in voting with specific documentation, and these states specifically do not allow concerns about the coronavirus to be a valid excuse to vote by mail. And we can see across these states, when we ask voters how easy they expect it will be to cast their ballots in November, Biden supporters are much more likely to say they feel like it will be easy in these states where voting by mail is more accessible. We see only 31% of Biden voters living in those states where excuses are required to send in their mail-in ballots, saying that they expect voting to be easy in November. Interestingly, there's no difference among Trump supporters. So when we look across the board, 64% of Trump supporters tell us that they feel like voting will be easy. That is, in every case, more, on average than Biden supporters who say that same thing. When we look about plans for or how people would prefer to vote, we can see similar patterns. Here in places that have long tradition of voting by mail, we see overwhelming majorities of Biden supporters saying they prefer that method, and the highest among Trump supporters saying they prefer to vote by mail, although still significantly lower than others, or than Biden supporters. And we can see that it sort of goes in a linear direction with the state policies. All right, the final thing I wanted to touch on here is just the political geography of the coronavirus in the United States. So we published this graphic a few months ago, and it was looking at the average number of deaths per day in each congressional district. So overall for the country in this gray line, and then in congressional districts held by Democrats in the blue line, and those held by Republicans in the red line. So early in the pandemic, it was Democratic areas that were the hardest hit by the health impacts of the coronavirus. So it was the New York City metro area, the Detroit metro area, a few places on the West Coast, some other places around the country, but it was primarily a thing that was affecting places where Democrats live. If we were to update this graphic today, you would see actually the lines have crossed, and now Republicans represent places that are experiencing more deaths on average than Democrats, as the pandemic has moved south and west into Texas and Arizona and Florida, and places that are more traditionally Republican strongholds. These are also many of the places that don't permit COVID-19 to be used as an excuse for absentee balloting. And so, this whole thing leaves sort of a big question mark over what turnout is going to look like in November. There's been a lot of reporting about the capacity of the U.S. Postal Service to handle mail-in ballots and different decisions the administration has made around the post office, and states continue to change their policies. So, going back to that question about predicting the outcome of the election, if you follow any of these things on Twitter, these people who are doing the models 538 and some of these other organizations, this is the big wild card for them, right? It's not only do you have to know what voters think, but you have to be able to make some prediction about who is going to turn out to vote. Is all of this uncertainty going to affect one party more than the other? And it's just really hard to say. So on that note of uncertainty, I think I will turn it over for questions. I hope we have some time.
Thank you very much for that informative and data-driven presentation. Sincerely appreciate it. While you were going over some of your slides, we had a question in the chat box that I'll kick us off with, and then we'll move on to more questions. This one's from Eric Tech at Navistar. How is civil unrest in several cities going to impact this election? I've read that this plays into Trump's hands. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is another huge issue when we look at the election this year. So we have seen just in the last few days more protests over the killing of another Black man in Wisconsin, and so this data comes from early, after the huge demonstrations following the killing of George Floyd. And so, across the board, we see large majorities expressing anger, both among Republicans and Democrats, who have these views. I think, it will be interesting to see moving forward. That is certainly in the messaging. If you've been following the Republican National Convention and some of these other events, there's been a lot of talk about unrest and a threat to the suburbs and these different a lot of messaging around that topic. I think we see, like we see here, anger on both sides, and then we see Republicans being much more likely than Democrats to say that people are taking advantage of these protests to engage in criminal behavior. And so you saw, I think, some of that play out in Wisconsin the other day with the shooting of protesters and other things. And so this is another hugely important element of the 2020 elections.
I was going to follow up and say, have those things played into the way the swing states now are being treated?
I don't know that I've seen data on that. We don't have the data to look at individual states where like Wisconsin, mm-hmm. where the protests are happening now, and so it would be interesting to know if attitudes are polarizing there quicker than other places. We don't have the data here yet to be able to tell.
Okay. Thank you. Sure. So we've got about 20 minutes of Q&A time. If you'd like to ask a question on video, just put your hand up. Otherwise, please use the chat box. And I know that my colleague Peter also had a question from AmCham Sweden. Peter, why don't you go ahead and ask your question? And then I just see another one came in the chat and a hand went up. Excellent. So lots of questions. Peter, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Alexandra, and thanks, Brad, for your presentation. So I have a question. I don't know if it's possible to answer, but it's more about like overall voter confidence, given this sort of conflagration of the Black Lives Matters protests, the attacks on mail-in ballots, which I saw just today. The president is now saying the problem with the mail-in ballots isn't the post office, it's the people counting them, which harkens back to the first time this century we had a presidential race where the winner of the Electoral College was not the winner of the popular vote, and the Gore-Bush election in 2000, where I think it took more than a month before the Supreme Court decided to stop the recount. And I wonder, like, how does all this sort of play, or do you guys do any research into how these factors play into voter confidence?
Definitely, yeah. So after the 2000 election, that's certainly something that we have focused on a lot. As you mentioned, that was a huge issue there. And typically, I should have included this in the slides, but typically we will do a survey just prior to the election, and then one just after, where we ask a similar set of questions, where we ask if people have confidence that their votes are going to be counted accurately, and then we ask after the election if they feel like that actually happened. Almost without fail, we see that the person who won the election, or supporters of the person who won the election, feel much more confident in the process afterwards than they did before. That actually wasn't true in 2016. If you remember the 2016 election, we saw prior to the election, Trump again casting some doubt on the process and making claims about voter fraud and different things. And so prior to the election, Republicans were very skeptical of the process, and after the election, they become much more confident in it. Among Democrats, we saw high levels of confidence in the process prior to the election in 2016, and then we saw after the election still high levels of confidence. And I think one explanation for that pattern is sort of negative partisanship, honestly. Like people, because that was Trump's messaging, Democrats were more likely to sort of push against it. So it will be interesting to see ahead of these elections, especially as I noted, with so much uncertainty around mail-in voting and a lot of messaging from the White House and other prominent Republicans about the potential concerns with security. It will be interesting to see what that pattern looks like this year. That's data that we don't have yet, but when we ask people about how they feel like the candidates should react after the election, we see in the abstract people say that, of course, the candidate who loses the election should concede. It's plausible anyway that attitudes will change once people know what the outcome of the election is, or once the results come in. So that is all left to see. Stay tuned to the Pew Research Center for more data there.
Thanks, Brad. So we have 16 minutes and we have a lot of questions to get through. So if you can treat the next few questions kind of like a rapid fire
Sure.
fire zone, then we can maybe even make it through everyone's questions. So in our chat box, next person up was Patricia Drake from MSC. She asks, at the Republican convention, it's clear that they're trying to gain more of the Black vote. Have we historically seen such an unexpected shift in minority groups such as women or LGBT?
Well, no, I would say so. So elections are won on the margins, and so the overall pattern, sometimes will, belies important movements that happen underneath the surface. But I'll just go back to these plots that I started with. So if you look at the country overall, like I say, it's been diversifying. I don't have the specific numbers broken out by race and ethnicity, but overall, Black Americans have been very steadfast Democratic supporters, and we haven't seen that move much. Anything is possible, certainly, but if history is any guide, there won't be much movement among blacks. One of the focal points for a lot of political consultants is, I'm sorry, I'm going off. I guess I should go to the next question. Sorry.
Well, I was going to say I have a question from Stephen at AmCham Denmark. Steve, do you want to pop on and quickly ask your question, and then I'll queue up the next one. It's clearly a popular topic.
Thanks, Alexander, and thanks, Brad. Hey, on one of your slides, you talked about how the voters across the board put a high level of importance on this election, and they're not ambiguous about how important it is for which of their candidates should win. Do you think that's going to result in a higher voter turnout? Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, so we have seen, tick-ups in voter participation. The 2018 midterms were among the highest midterm turnout that we've ever seen in the United States. And if this were a typical year, it would probably be a very safe prediction to say that turnout would be as high as we've ever seen it. Because of all the uncertainty around the coronavirus, I think that throws a little wrench into that. But we definitely see in our voter engagement measures the highest levels that we've ever measured.
Thank you.
Thank you. I see right in front of me, Pavel Stanev asks in the chat box, has the civil unrest increased in recent years in US, or is it exaggerated by the social media age?
That is a good question. We don't have data on that in particular. There's a way in which the two things interact, of course, right? And so the social media age makes it easier for people to organize and makes particularly these videos of police misconduct and police violence more accessible to everyone. And so whenever one of these incidents happens, videos start circulating on social media, and there's a way in which I think that the two things can sort of both be true.
Yeah, and I remember when we chatted ahead of this session, you had mentioned that one of the more surprising things was that what we're seeing now is actually quite a long-term trend. It didn't just arrive because social media arrived.
Yep.
That the partisanship has been brewing for a significant period of time. All right, next question. Alexander Lang asked in the chat box, how useful do you think models like the one published by 538 are?
I'm not going to comment specifically on those models. I'll say in 2016, one of the problems with the modeling was that you had a lot of these different models, and they're all basically using the same data, right? So there are a set of publicly available public opinion polls, and that is the only thing they can use. And then there's a little bit of kind of statistical special sauce that gets added on top, but all of these things are driven by the quality of the data. To get back to briefly to that question about can we trust the polls, I think it's important to know that not all opinion polls are created equal. So there are data quality concerns. It's become much easier to conduct surveys in the internet age. But it's not always clear the quality of some of those things. So the Pew Research Center goes to great expense to make sure that our surveys are representative and that we have confidence in our data. It is not always the case for every poll that is conducted.
That's one of the reasons we like working with you, and appreciate also getting your mailing and your newsletters. And now we actually have a hand raised. Eric Tech, if you want to quickly put on your mic and video and ask your question. Or you had a question while he was speaking. Go.
Yeah, there we go. Hey, I guess this is a little bit of a follow-up on the civil unrest, and you know, I've read a lot that that the suburban I guess the suburban female white vote is really important in these kind of swing states, and how do you have any like data or research on how they're seeing this and which of the two parties they feel more comfortable with, you know, based on some of the issues that are happening?
Yeah, so I think one of the reasons that group gets so much attention is because they do fall sort of in the middle on their political orientation. So in our data where we look at the partisan breakdowns of people who live in urban, suburban and rural places, you know, suburban people fall kind of in the middle, where urban residents have been trending towards the Democratic Party, rural residents have been trending towards the Republican Party. I think there's a feeling that the suburban voters are a little more up for grabs. So there was a lot of attention to that in the 2018 midterms. There was a feeling that you know, and some data to back it up, that white suburban women soured on Trump and voted for Democrats in the House elections there. And I think there's the hope that they can be won back in some way. And so our data does bear that out, that they sort of fall in the middle there, and that's probably why they receive so much attention.
That makes sense. I have a question also coming in from my colleague from Norway, Tyler. Do you want to put your video and mic on and ask your question?
Yes, absolutely. And Brad, thank you for such an insightful presentation. I really appreciate the methodological and practical complexities of compiling all this data. And that's what my question is going to talk about a bit. For us lay people, I think a way of dealing with the complexities, we make simplifications. You know, the South is Republican, the Northeast is Democratic, and that's based off, you know, data to some degree as well. Of course, though, the interesting thing about American politics is even within regions, there are some states, pairs of states that vote differently. And I think Vermont and New Hampshire is probably the clearest example. But I was wondering, when you're crunching all these numbers, are there any states in particular that you think are interesting, or pairs of states that are kind of deviating from these overarching demographic trends across the country? Maybe in the upper Midwest area, as you hinted at before, something interesting there?
Yeah, so, you know, like I said before, our data doesn't allow us to speak directly to trends in individual states. But, you know, American politics is like this sort of, you know, like you said, like this fractal of you know, you can just keep going deeper and deeper and finding interesting things the deeper you go. So even within states, you know, the cities versus the surrounding suburbs, versus the rural regions, really fascinating trends throughout. You know, I think the Southwest is one of the more interesting places in American politics today. There's been a lot of talk about Texas and the potential. You know, there's this big question: is Texas a swing state now? And big demographic changes there have led it to be trending a little towards the Democratic Party, which is interesting. Also, Arizona and New Mexico and the whole American Southwest is a fascinating place. The vote returns and different things give you a lot of texture there, but it's hard to separate that from the questions of turnout and different other factors that are important in this. So it's long been our ambition to expand our public opinion polling so that we can do that sort of granular work, but we're not quite there yet.
Thank you very much, Brad.
Sure.
Thank you. And we have time for one more question, which was actually about the Electoral College. Jennifer asked, how does the Electoral College play into the election and the results? How can you poll for the Electoral College? What does that data mean?
Yeah, so, well, like I said, we are not in the business of predicting the outcome or trying to project our results and turn it into an Electoral College prediction, but it definitely plays out in the way that campaigns work. So the Electoral College means that relatively smaller states exert an outsized role in presidential politics. And so because every state, regardless of their size, has at least 3 electors, it is, that plays into the strategic calculations of the campaigns. So that means that people living in small states like Wyoming, Rhode Island, and places like that have sort of more representation than people living in California or Texas. And when we ask people about that, if they feel like the Electoral College should be reformed in some way, we actually don't see much comfort with doing that. It's more so among Democrats than among Republicans, probably because of recent experience. But people are kind of small c conservative in terms of making changes to the process. And so, it probably doesn't get directly at your question, but it certainly is an important element of American politics.
Thank you so much, Brad, for joining us. I think that's all we have time for today. A warm thank you to you for taking your time and sharing your expertise with us. To everyone who attended, I will confirm that we are able to share Brad's slides for you all. And a warm thank you to my Nordic colleagues for putting this together with us. If you are enjoying what we are doing and our U.S. election coverage, our next session will be a U.S. election update with Steve Scully of C-SPAN. That'll be on September 8th and in Helsinki at 5 o'clock and in the rest of the Nordics at 4 o'clock. And on behalf of my team at AmCham Finland and of myself and my Nordic colleagues, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again to Pew Research Center. And we hope to see you all on September 8th. Thank you very much. And goodbye.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.